lots of materials to cover. So today's class is going to be based on the, so in the past chapters we were dealing with basic economic principles. So today we are going to start looking at one of the chapters that covers macroeconomics and some basic concepts about macroeconomics. So so let me make this smaller so I can see it. So we are going to start with this is very hard to manage sometimes. Okay. So we are going to be describing some concepts. So one of the main concepts is the concept of GDP, gross domestic product. So I haven't been able to look at the market in these past days, but I was looking at some of the cases. So I like to watch the Wall Street Journal, what they say. So the market today is very strong, as we can see. Then we have Bloomberg. So some of the issues discussed here are also important. So I'm just looking at the basic of stocks business. So in the past days, you probably noticed that the markets were down, and that was because of the assassination of this person in Iran. So markets were very scared and they lost so much. But in the past days, look at this, almost 29,000 points, which is extremely high. So that tells a lot about the economy. I was mentioning the Dow Jones versus the Standard & Poor's. NASDAQ is for technology. So it seems that things are not bad. So and all these political conflicts are also affecting the stock market, but these politics are not too strong. So in the past, I just want to mention that, for example, anything that happened in the Middle East affected the markets very strongly. And the reason for that was because the United States depended way too much on foreign oil. So in the past years, the United States became the largest producer of oil in the world. So this conflict in the Middle East basically didn't affect the ability of the US to produce oil. So I have this chart of countries. As you can see, the top 10 countries in oil production, the United States is the largest by producing 12 billion barrels per day, followed by Russia, Saudi Arabia, and all these countries. So the US does not rely in oil as before. So that's one of the explanations why this guy's death didn't affect the stock market in the United States. So having said that, let me just erase this. So erase this. So yesterday it seemed that it went up to 211 points. So so once again, I'm mentioning this because all these facts affect the United States. Whether something happened in America, low job reports, high reports for jobs, inflation, anything affect the economy, also things that happen abroad. Okay, so and I'm mentioning this because we're going to be looking at the gross domestic product. So before analyzing the gross domestic product, I want to bring you back to I want to bring you back to, so one of the episodes in the American history, which is the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was an episode where the GDP fell very sharply, and many people felt the pains of lower production. So that happened because of financial issue. You might remember that during the Great Depression, many people ran to their banks. They tried to pull out their monies, but because everybody did it, so the whole financial system collapsed. And remember, the financial system is like the grease for the wheel. So money moves the financial system, the economic system. So we need money for almost everything. Okay, so when the financial system collapsed during the Great Depression, that was a big event. So many people lost their jobs, and that was an economic crisis of huge consequences. Unemployment rate was almost 25%. Remember that the 5% is the one that we are expecting. So at 25% is extremely high. So, so that happened during the Great Depression. So what do we know, how we can analyze these facts? Well, let me tell you something. So basically in macroeconomics, we have, like for example, how can we avoid this issue? Well, policymakers basically care about these three topics, which is economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation. If you hear let's say the candidates talking about the economy, they are always offering more jobs, and they are going to create more jobs, and they are going to create more jobs. Well, in fact, governments don't create jobs. So they promote economic growth. So they write policy that allows investors and workers to work in a good environment that promotes economic growth. So when a candidate tells you that he or she is going to create jobs, they probably are lying. It has to do on the way they do it. So if you are implementing more restrictions, more taxes, more everything, very likely economic growth is going to decline. But if you are a government that promotes more production and rewards people produce more, so very likely we are going to have this economic growth. I'm muting everybody, it seems that it's a little bit of background noise. So some of these goals are going to be achieved by something that we know in the theory. So there are different approaches that we can use. So for example, the goals of economic growth, low unemployment, and low inflation are going to be accomplished by analyzing the issue through the supply, or the Keynesian model, or the neoclassical model. So those are three different perspectives that we can use to analyze the economy and achieve the economic goals. So, and this is what the theory says, but in practice, we are using policy to influence the economy. So we are going to analyze two different types of policies. Those are policy tools or economic policy. So one is monetary policy, another one is fiscal policy. So monetary policy is achieved by the Federal Reserve System, and the fiscal policy is done by the government, the federal government, basically the President of the United States, and in coordination with the Congress. So when a political party says that they are working hard, they are basically implementing policy from their own point of view. Remember, in order to become law, the fiscal policy, any change in taxation and spending has to be approved by the Congress and has to be signed by the President. So it's a coordinated effort. So when parties are not working together, and when parties are not working together, plus the President is not working together, so this fiscal policy can be highly inefficient. It might take longer time than usual. So we are going to keep an eye on these three things. So this chart shows how macroeconomics is about goals, a consensus of what are the most important goals for the macroeconomy, the frameworks, the tools that we use to analyze the economy, and the policies. So how the federal government and government institutions influence policy. So, so we are going to review these three concepts more in depth. So as you can see, we have a whole chapter on unemployment and a whole chapter on inflation. So then we are going to analyze the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model in one of our modules. And the last two chapters are going to be dedicated for monetary and fiscal policy. So I will talk more about that in another class. So I want to define this. This is very important. So how do we know what is the state of the economy? Well, we have a measure that talks about the size of the economy, any economy in the world. It can be the US economy, the Mexican economy, the Argentinian economy, the French economy. So all of them are measured in what is called gross domestic product, the so-called GDP. So the GDP is very important because it's the value expressed in monetary currency. So the monetary value of the output of all final goods and services. I am emphasizing the role of final goods and services because not all goods are final. I want to explain that in a little bit. So this is the monetary value of all the final goods and services produced within a country in a given year, okay? So those are the things that make gross domestic product what it is. It's a monetary value of final goods and services that are produced within a country and in a specific year. So that basically measures the size of the overall economy. So let me see if I can find briefly GDP countries. So probably, so this is basically the GDP by country. We have the US with the largest GDP, followed by China and Japan. So Japan, even though it's a very small country, they have a huge production. So Germany, India, this is an emerging economy, is not a rich country, but they produce a lot, as well as China, France, the UK, Italy. So those are the largest economy in the world. So as we can see, the US is by far the largest economy in the world. But China is catching up. So in the last year, China has been growing very fast, and it's expected that China in 10, 5, 20 years, they are going to surpass the output that is produced by the United States. And that is not a bad news. The US is going to be happy that China, Japan, and Germany, and all the countries are doing better because that represents business opportunities with them. So when China grows, when Japan grows, people get more money. So they are likely to buy some goods that are produced in the United States. So that is a good news. So it's the same thing. The US, we are not going to be happy if any of these countries or any country doesn't do well, because at some point we are doing business with them. So we are very invested in the countries to do well. So because that is positive for the US, and also when they are doing not good, that is not good for the US. So, so once again, GDP, it helps me, as we can see, to see how big the countries are. So in this case, in terms of production, the US is the largest country. So, so GDP alone speaks about the size of the economy. Okay, so that is very important, measures the size of the nation economy. So an economy's GDP can be measured either by the total amount or the total dollar value of what consumers purchase in an economy, or the total value of what the country produces. So we can divide the measurement of the GDP by seeing how people spend the money or just by computing how many goods and what are the prices for this economy. So who buys? So in terms of the first one, the total value of what consumers purchase in the economy. So we can divide the demand for production. So what is produced and bought. This is from the expenditure point of view. How people who have money in their pockets spend their money in goods. And we can recognize 4 different items that constitute the GDP. So the aggregate demand, so let me probably the aggregate demand, something that we are going to call, or first of all, the GDP, which is going to define our aggregate demand. That's a term that I am going to explain later today. So that is going to be equal to what consumers spend plus what business spend, which is called investments. So as you can see, consumption, those are the households, what the business spend, what the government spends. And finally, we are going to account for what we sell to other countries minus what we buy from other countries. So those are exports minus imports. So that is going to be called the net exports, or it's going to be also called the trade balance. When exports, let's put a note here. When exports, when X minus M, when X minus M is greater than 0, or let's do the following. When exports are greater than imports. So when we sell more goods abroad than the goods that we buy from other countries, we have a so-called trade surplus. When the opposite happens, when exports are less than imports, so we buy more goods from other countries, so our trade balance is going to be trade deficit. Okay, so we have these important concepts. So we have these important concepts. So we have a GDP that is made out of four different items: consumption, investments, government spending, and the so-called net exports that are also called trade balance. So this last item, the trade balance, when exports are higher than imports, we have a surplus. And when imports are greater than exports, we have a trade deficit. Just for your information, the United States has traditionally had a trade deficit. For example, the trade deficit of the United States is $500 billion a year. So that's a lot of money. So this is the difference between what we export and we import, what we import. So we are importing more goods than what we are selling abroad. So our trade is in deficit. Is that a good thing? Not necessarily. Having a trade deficit or a trade surplus is not that bad as long as we don't do it every year. However, this trade deficit has been in this economy since many years. So we have these trade deficits. So that might not be the best thing that we can do. Let me have my coffee. So this is the importance of the different items that I just mentioned. For instance, we have consumption is almost 70% of our GDP. So your decisions as households, people like you and me, decide to buy a slice of pizza, probably a computer, maybe a car, maybe a refrigerator. So all these things are consumption. So very likely our choices are going to impact the economy. So in this equation, so this alone represents almost 70% of the economy. So our choices of consumption are very strong because they define what the other agents are going to do. So for example, if I decide to buy a car, very likely the producer of cars says, well, that's good. I probably will produce more cars because people are buying cars. So at some point, governments are also spending money in some ways. But consumption choices are basically very important for the economy. So represent almost 70% of all the choices. So investments, we can see 16.7% are less than the government intervention in this economy. So people who say that we are a market economy, that is not right, because we are a mixed economy. So the interaction between investments, private investments and governments and consumption is very strong in either way. So so we can say that we have a mixed economy. So we have consumption very strong. We have investments that are made by private companies and government expenditure. So as we can see, government expenditure is very strong. So it's even higher than the private investment. So the role of governments in the United States is very, very strong. So if we account for export minus imports, so we can see that exports represented the 11, almost 12%, imports 14.5%. So this is money going out, this is money coming in. So this is in negative numbers. So this is how the distribution of the different items that we have in the economy are apportioned. Once again, consumption is one of the most important things. I don't know if you have heard in the economy that there is a report on consumer sentiments or consumer, it's called the consumer sentiment. So every month, every week, the policy makers measure how confident some consumers are. So if consumers are confident, so very likely the economy is going to grow because people are going to be spending money. So if consumer confidence is low, so very likely the economy is going to decline. So keep an eye in economic reports when they speak about consumption, and they do so because the role of consumers is very strong in the US economy. As in most of the economies, most of the times consumption is very strong. It's almost around 65, 60, 70% in most of the countries around the world. So those are the components of GDP. As we can see, consumption almost 68%, almost 70% has been that way for many years. In the past years, consumption has increased a little. Government spending very strong, most of the times bigger than private investments. So only a few times, I think this is part of the Clinton era. So there was a slight increase in investments, but 2008, the economic downturn, government intervention was strong, whereas in private investments decline. Traditionally, also imports have been higher than exports. I was mentioning since the 80s, we're having these huge trade deficits. So in the past, they were not that important, but let's say in the 80s, so the gap between exports and imports started increasing. The 90s narrow. Then the 2000s, the gap is becoming extremely high. So closing the gap might be good, and in some cases has been very difficult for policymakers. So we have this graph, which is the same as the previous one. So so the importance of this is to highlight the relevance of consumption and trade balance. So so one of these well, paying attention on this area, so the net exports. So, so the net exports components is also called trade balance, is equal to the dollar value of exports minus the dollar value of imports. So trade balance is the gap or the difference between exports and imports. And when exports are higher than imports, we have a trade surplus. When imports are higher than exports, so we have a trade deficit. And once again, traditionally, the trade gap between the US and other countries, the so-called trade deficit, has been around $500 billion. Okay? Lots of money. So based on the 4 components of demand, I think I wrote that equation before. This is very important because the equation that I just wrote is called the fundamental macroeconomic equation. So this fundamental macroeconomic equation helps me to explain how the economy works. So we divided, as I said before, the GDP in consumption, investment, government expenditure, and trade balance. So this is, it can be expressed with words or just simply with letters. So this is a convention. GDP equals to consumption, investments, government spending, and the trade balance. So if the trade balance is positive, GDP is going to be higher. If trade balance is negative, GDP is going to decline. So we have to keep an eye on these values, because once these values are increasing, they are going to increase the GDP, and vice versa. If consumption is lower, GDP is going to be lower. If investors don't want to invest, GDP is going to be lower. Or if the government doesn't want to spend money or lower taxes, because lowering taxes also affects these 2 components, consumption and investment. So the GDP is going to decline. So we are hoping that every time at least consumption increases in order to have a growing economy. So once again, this is the fundamental macroeconomic equation. So the other way to look at production is not only by measuring the components of the GDP, but by also looking what is produced in America, for example, in this case, or in any other country. So in this case, we can also measure the production by looking at goods that are durable, like, for example, long-lasting, like cars or refrigerators, non-durable, like food and clothing, services, anything that is intangible, like entertainment, healthcare, or education, construction, all the structures, buildings as residence, factories, and the change in inventories. Many times, let's say cars are like durable goods, goods are produced. General Motors decides to produce goods, but they expect to sell 2 million cars, but they only sell 1.8 million. So 200,000 are going to be part of the inventories. So those inventories are going to be changing over time. So those are the changing inventories are also goods that were produced but have not been sold yet. So every market transaction must have a buyer and a seller. So GDP must be the same whether measured by what is demanded or by what is produced. So once we know a little bit more about what is GDP, let me go back to the definition. Because, so I was mentioning the monetary value, that is very important, because how do you know how much is produced? Well, we need to pay attention on the monetary value. That's the comparison tool. So final goods refers to the following. For example, I am a producer of bread, right? So I am a baker. So I have my own bakery. I'm gonna produce bread for selling. So I am not gonna account for the value of the wheat then when it becomes flour, and then when it's sold to the intermediary and then sold to me. So I'm not going to account for any of these costs. So the price of bread is going to be the bread as is when it's ready to be sold. So I'm going to ignore all the values before because those are intermediate goods. So I'm going to account for the value of bread. I'm going to ignore the value of the wheat, the value of the flour, and all the costs that have been happening before. I don't care because if I take only the value of the final goods, I am avoiding what is called double accounting. I'm not accounting the previous cost. The cost that matters for the gross domestic product is the good as is ready to be sold, okay? So also this idea within a country, it doesn't matter who produces the good. What matters is that this good is produced within the boundaries of the United States. For example, we have a car that is made in Detroit. For example, Toyota builds a car in Detroit. That is part of the gross domestic product. Why? Well, it was made by a foreign company, but was made in America. So we have this production made in America, regardless who produces it. It's almost the same case as General Motors produces a car in France. So is that part of the gross domestic product? The answer is no, because the car was made in France. Even though it was made by an American company, that is not produced, or that was not produced in the boundaries of the United States. So also in a given year means that, for example, if I buy a house today that was built in 2000, so is that part of the GDP of this year? The answer is no. That house was accounted as part of the GDP in 2000. Therefore, it's not part of the GDP in 2020, okay? So those are very important issues. So the monetary value, the fact that we're talking about final goods and not intermediate goods, and the fact that the production has been built within a country in a given year. So those are very important factors in the definition of the gross domestic product, okay? So if you guys have any questions at any time, please let me know. So I'm gonna try to go a little bit faster because we have to cover a lot. So, so this is the percentage of production by what is produced, durable, non-durable structures. As we can see, services is almost 62%. So that doesn't surprise me because GDP, so most of the production in America is not manufactured. For example, that can talk about a little bit about manufacturers. Some of the non-durable goods might include agriculture, but most of the production is services. So people are educators, people are working in healthcare, people are working in financial services, people are working in computer sciences. So all of them are services. Most of the economy, or the US economy, is mostly based on services. If we go back to the 70s, the 60s, so most of the production was probably non-durable and durable. So manufacturers and agriculture were a big part of the production. But nowadays, what we produce in America is basically services. So services make up for the 60% of the production. So in this case, the change of inventories is too small, that is not shown. But as we can see, these two items basically account, or these items account for manufacturers, which are a very small portion of our production, okay? Once again, the US economy is based on the production of services. So services versus the other goods, we can see how services have skyrocketed in the past years, and some of the non-durable goods like agriculture and manufacturing, some durable goods are also losing grounds. So structures have been very important. So this is the crisis of 2008, more or less. So the decline in the production of houses. So, so we have I'm doing a class. I think I'm going to be done by 10. 10? Yes.
Excuse me, sir.
he has it.
Did you put the wrong till 9?
Well, I was just hold on one second. Estoy en medio de una clase, ¿sí? Sí, hablé esta mañana con alguien en la oficina y me dijeron que iba a estar vacío.
Hasta las 9.
Bueno.
Sí, señor.
No, pero ese no fue mi. Bueno, adelante. Okay, I'm gonna make a pause. I'm gonna change the room. Please hold on for a second.
Buenas, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, bien.
Va a haber una clasita de 2 horas acá.
Ok, no está bien.
Me disculpo, pero digamos.
Yo pregunté abajo y me dijeron que
mientras no haya clasecita, está disponible para todo el mundo.
Me dijeron ayer que no iba a estar. Estoy en medio de una clase. Estoy en medio de una clase. No, esto es.
Mira, te recomiendo.
Mal hecho. Ayer hablé con la gente y me dijeron que iba a estar vacío. Estoy en medio de una clase.
¿Qué te informó eso?
En la recepción pregunté varias veces y me dijeron que iba a estar vacío.
Un problema de comunicación.
Pues, muy malo, amigo, porque estoy en medio de una clase.
Mira, quédate.
No,
yo lo resuelvo, no hay problema. Quédate.
Yes, please. I mean, I apologize, but I am in the middle of a class and I asked.
I don't make a phone call, so you can
okay.
Class. I don't.
Okay, sorry about that. I mean, I asked many times, and I'm very upset.
Because the other room is reserved as well, so.
Yeah, I mean, I asked many times, so I'm so sorry about that. I have to go back to my class, and I have 2 more sessions today. So are you guys there? Sorry. Okay, so I'm assuming that nothing happened, so I'm going to keep talking.
Yes, Professor.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, so I was mentioning this component of GDP. So once again, the U.S. economy is going to be is based on the production of services, and this is how. So those are the percentages that show how the different types of production. So so I was talking about the double counting problem. So that is the reason the GDP only accounts for the final goods and services, because we don't want to include the intermediate goods. So any good that is used to produce other goods, so they are intermediate goods. So we are only accounting for the final goods and services. So in that case, we're going to be avoiding what is called the double account, the double counting. So that's the reason this GDP is going to be so what it is, not inflated. In many cases, we don't want to inflate the GDP too much. So that's the reason we are avoiding the double counting. So so at the end, as I mentioned before, the GDP, the gross domestic product, is the total value of all final goods and services produced in the economy in a year. So once again, monetary value, final goods produced within the boundaries of a country in a specific year. Okay, so so I was mentioning the idea of GDP. So remember, the GDP measures the domestic production, but there are other ways to measure GDP. In this case, we have the gross national product. So different from the gross domestic product, so the GDP includes what American producers produce not only in America, but also around the world. So the gross national product includes what is produced domestically and what is produced by domestic labor and business abroad in a year. So everything that is produced by an American citizen is going to be part of the gross national product. Okay, so if we subtract depreciation for the gross national product, we are going to get the net national product. So the GNP minus the value of depreciation is going to be called the net national product. It also applies to the gross domestic product if we subtract the value of depreciation. So so we are going to get the net domestic product. So anything that when we subtract depreciation becomes the net. Okay. So the net national product can be further divided into national income, includes all the wages, profits, rents. So this is another way to account for the national, the production in America or in any other countries, when we, rather than see how people spend the money, is how they are paid. Like, for example, workers receive wages, entrepreneurs get the profits, landlords get the rents, and all these values are added in order to account for the so-called national income. So we can see GDP from the point of view of expenditures by accounting for consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports, or we can look at this at the national income level, but we are accounting for all these factors. Okay, so and this is very important too. So we have the gross domestic product, but we have two different dimensions of this gross domestic product. One that is nominal and the other one that is real. So the nominal, so the is the GDP value at the current prices. For example, I am producing 20 apples today, and the apple of each, the price of each apple is $1. So I multiply 20 by 1, so it's going to be $20 GDP. So if I produce 20 apples the year before and the price was 50 cents, so my nominal value is going to be $10. So probably the same amount, but what changes is the prices. So the nominal value, as we can see, is not adjusted by inflation. So in order to adjust by inflation, we are going to use what is called the real value. So most of the times we're going to, or a very important way to measure GDP is by looking at the value when it has been adjusted for inflation. So that is called the real value, the real GDP. So generally speaking, you cannot compare nominal values because you are comparing different metrics. But when you account for inflation, you can compare these two different values of GDP. Nominal is not comparable. Real, you can make comparisons, okay? So that's the thing. We're gonna see some little examples. Well, this is how it looks, the nominal, as we can see, because production and prices are always growing. So GDP seems to be always a line that grows. For example, from 60 to 2010, we can see the nominal value of GDP, okay? So, so that's a definition. So that is not necessarily true, because when we account for prices, this line is going to be more like this, you see? So, and this is a very long time series, so we cannot see fluctuations of GDP. We have like 50 years in just a little space, so we cannot see the fluctuations of GDP, okay? So, so in many cases, to transform the nominal GDP into real GDP, we are going to use a price index that is called the GDP deflator. So the GDP deflator is the price index measuring the average prices of all goods and services in the economy. So let me see if I can find a definition of the GDP deflator. Here's the formula. So the GDP deflator, let me see if I can imagine this formula. So we are going to divide the nominal by the real. Hold on. Well, the real is basically called the base year. So if we have different years, like for example here, we're going to choose one of the years as the base year. So like for example here, I'm going to choose, let's say 2014 as the base year. So this is going to be the nominal divided by the base year, and then multiplied by 100, because this is an index and has to be expressed in percentages. So, so we have this. So once again, in this time series, I'm going to choose 1 year, and that year becomes the base year, which is going to be the real. And then if I divide each year by the base year, I'm going to get the real GDP. So, so actually, it seems that in this case, 2010 was the base year. How do I know? Because they are dividing the nominal by the real, which in this case, the base year was 2010. So this is the 100%, right? So, so basically, so once again, the GDP deflator is going to be the nominal each year divided by the chosen base year. So the base year is chosen by policymakers. It depends very much on many factors. So it can be chosen by, for example, some, like in 2008, there was a big economic downturn that might probably change many things in the economy. So policymakers might say, well, this is a good referential point for this base year. So, so this is, so if I want to calculate, in this case, convert the nominal GDP into real GDP, I'm going to divide the nominal GDP by the price index divided by 100. So I don't know if we have an example. Yes, we have an example here. So the price index is the same GDP deflator. So in many cases, as we can see here, we just get the information from the GDP deflator. We know that we can find the GDP deflator by choosing the base year and then dividing it by the year. So if I choose 2005 as the base year, I'm going to divide this by the base year, and I'm going to get almost a 19%. So that's the way they did it. So there might be some ways to do it. I don't know. It says 2005 is 100%. So that makes sense. This is going to be the base year. So the GDP deflator, once again, is found by dividing the nominal by the base year. So years previous to the base year, the GDP deflator is going to be less than 100%. Any value that goes after 2005, in this particular case, that 2005 is the base year, is going to be a higher GDP deflator. So, so in this case, we're going to find, if we are given a price index, we're going to convert this price index into a decimal form. So, and we are going to divide the nominal by this price index in decimal form. So instead of percentages, we are going to use the percentage form, what I just said, the decimal point. Okay. So so if I have 100, well, in this case, for example, so the calculations are as follows. So I'm going to use the nominal, in this case, divided by the price index in decimal form. So the value of these $543 billion at the prices of 2005 is going to be $2,859,000,000. So, so that is done once again. If I want to compare the 543 with the 13 trillions, that is not possible because those are different measures. Once again, the prices are different in these two cases. But if I use the deflator and I divide the nominal GDP by the price index, I'm going to get the real GDP. So I can compare the value of this with this value, right? So because they are given in the same prices. So the prices that I'm going to find in this column are going to be a reflection of the base year. So therefore, they can be compared. Once again, I cannot compare this nominal with this nominal with this nominal because they have different values. But if I use the real, all these values are going to be comparable. So, so and the base year, who chooses? Once again, policymakers choose the years by some criteria. So we have this case, we solve this. So once again, so because this is the 100%, so we are dividing this by 1. So this number is exactly the same. So this is these are the nominals, these are the real values. So we can compare, like we can say how much production has grown between 1 year to another, okay? So, I hope it's clear. So there are many examples in sapling learning that you can solve. So if you have any question, please let me know. So, so we have years, nominal GDP. The GDP deflator in all the computations have to be given. In some cases, if it's not given, you have to calculate it. The book doesn't say how to calculate this, but we can Google it and you can find many ways to solve this case, okay? So there's a question and the question says, yes, I'm gonna be uploading these slides because the ones in Blackboard are not the correct ones, yes. And along with this lecture, okay? So we have, so once again, calculating real GDP. So we covered that. Another question. Okay, that sounds good. So, so this is the difference between the real and the nominal. So nominal, as you can see, grows more exponentially. Real GDP, because we are deflating the production or converting the production into values of a specific year. So we are gonna get this more smooth growth. So in some cases, capture more what happens in the economy. So in many cases, that's what's happening. So 2000 something here, the real GDP was lower than the nominal. So, so this is also very important. So how do I know that the economy grew in some extent? Well, first of all, I cannot make comparisons as I mentioned before. If I measure the growth rate between 1960 and 2005, that is going to be misleading because those are nominal prices, or this is the nominal GDP. So once I have the real GDP, I'm going to be able to measure how much the economy grew in percentage-wise between 1 year and another. So in this case, the goal is to find the growth rate between 2010 and 1960. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this one, the 2010 GDP in real value, and I'm going to subtract this 1960. So that's the previous year. So this is the current year minus the previous year divided by the previous year. So so if so this 2010 GDP is going to be this number. This is the 1960. So I'm going to subtract this, and then I am going to divide it by this. So the question is how much the economy grew. Well, in this case, it's extremely big because we are accounting for almost 50 years. So the economy grew in 376%. But we can measure changes year by year, which is more likely to happen. So policymakers don't take these big comparisons. They like to compare what happens between years, even between months and other periods. So in this case, this is a very large difference, but the principle applies: the current year minus the previous year divided by the previous year. And that has to be multiplied by 100 because this is a percentage. So in this case, once again, the economy grew in 376%. So that makes sense, 1960 versus 2010. So accounting by the real magnitude of GDP, we can see that economic growth has been very, very good in America. So, and this is very good because what happens is, if you remember, I mentioned that GDP gives you the size of the economy. The growth rate tells you how fast the economy grows between years, okay? So, so in this case, we have, like for example, the usual economic growth has to be at least 3%. So we mentioned that before, 3% economic growth is a very healthy economic growth. And some countries like China, they have grown at a rate of 10%. Other countries like South Korea, Singapore, also very strong economic growth. It's not good when the economy grows at a rate less than 3%. So in many cases, that has been the case. So, so in this case, the growth rate, the computation of the growth rate tells me how fast the economy grows. And the GDP alone, once again, tells me the size of the economy. So with this real growth, the growth rate, so we can track real changes in GDP over time. So these GDP are reported by institutions in yearly basis. So in some cases, GDP is reported in quarterly basis. In the US, data collection is very strong, and we might have information on quarterly changes of GDP. So, and at some point, that information fits the computation of the yearly report. So, but what is true is when this growth rate declines, so the growth rate becomes lower and lower, so that is called recession. So this is a significant decline in the national output or the so-called GDP. So, and recessions sometimes are so strong that they become depressions. So this is a lengthy and deep decline in output. So recessions are bad, depressions are even stronger. So this is how the US looks. As you remember, this is the first graph. So this is a very long time series. Well, we have even longer here, but this is more detailed. So we have changes in the real GDP. So we can see times when the economy booms and times when the economy declines. For example, this little thing is the 2008 recession in the United States. So of course, because this is too many years, so the changes look very small. But if we look this in some other like shorter time series, we are going to be able to see the fluctuations of the economy over the years. So almost finally for today, so all these things are very meaningful. So at the beginning of the class, I always ask students so what are their expectations? Like for example, in time of a crisis, they say, well, the crisis is gonna pass. So people know that because that is part of the theory in economics. So we have these, the so-called business cycles. So a business cycle, let me see if I have the picture here. I don't have the picture here. I can find it. So business cycles. So this is an stylized graph of what happens in the economy. Let me see if I can see a better graph here. So this is a better graph. So what the business cycle says, well, at some point the economy grows. So there is a boom in the economy grows. So then reaches a maximum that is called a peak. So once the peak has been reached, so the economy starts losing grounds and becomes, enters into a recession. So that recession can be very strong and can become a depression. So then we reach the drought, which is the lowest level of the depression, and then the recovery starts. So that is, again, it starts with another cycle of economic growth or expansion, also called boom. So the economy starts growing, recovers, grows, reaches another peak, and then it starts declining. That has happened for almost many centuries. So we have this idea of the business cycle. We have the peak, the drought. So the recession lasts from peak to drought, and economic upswings run from drought to peak. So, so a recession, it starts from the peak and then goes down, and the upswing runs from the drought and it starts and ends with the peak. So that is called the business cycle. So this is the economy's relatively short-term movement in and out of the recession. So the last topic I want to mention, that's going to be, so once again, we can compute the GDP of the United States. So we also know that we can compute the size and we can compute whether the GDP is nominal or real. So so we have these comparisons, but this is for this country, right? But every single country computes their own GDP. So how do we know that GDP changes between one country and another? So so we are going to use the exchange rate to compute changes well, not to compute changes, to make comparisons between countries. So we have here a little formula. So this is compare Brazil's GDP of 2013. So the value of the GDP is 4.8 trillion reals. So the reals is the currency of Brazil. So we are gonna compare this with the production of the United States. So can we compare these two values? Well, practically no, because the GDP of Brazil is given in reals, the GDP for the United States is given in dollars. So what we have to do is to convert this Brazilian production in American dollars. So to convert Brazil's GDP into US dollars, so this is the Brazil GDP in US dollars is going to be equal to the actual value, to the current value, of the real value of GDP in the domestic currency divided by the exchange rate. So in this case, we have an exchange rate of 2.157 reals per dollar. So I'm gonna divide this, $4.8 trillion by the exchange rate. So I'm gonna get the GDP in American dollars. So once again, can I compare these $2.246 trillion of Brazil with the $16.6 trillion in America? The answer is yes. Can I compare these reals with the dollars? The answer is no. So here we make a transformation of the Brazil GDP in domestic currency into American dollars. So now we are able to compare these two GDPs. And as we can see, the GDP in the US is almost 7-8 times higher than the one in Brazil. So, so we have the GDP that measures the size. We have the GDP, the growth rate of GDP that measures how fast the economy grows. And we have the GDP per capita. So we can divide the real GDP by the population. So if we divide the real value of GDP by the population, we are going to get the GDP per capita. So this is dividing all the production by the people in a country. So we see how much in average each one produces. So this is very important because once again, GDP measures the size, GDP growth measures how fast the economy grows, but the GDP per capita measures what is called the standards of living. So when we want to see GDP per capita, so we are measuring basically the standards of living. So I have a GDP per capita by countries. So we have some measures here. Well, you can Google it and you can find them. So there are, this is some of the list. So, and of course, many countries like Qatar, they are the largest, they have the largest GDP per capita. Of course, population is very low and they produce oil. So they have $130,000 per person. The United States, where is the United States here? It's almost 50 something. The US is here. I just saw it. Oh, it's here. So $62,000 per person. So that's the per capita production in America. So And once again, this talks about the standards of living in a country. So if we compare the GDP per capita of the US, like for example, with some of the lowest, from 60,000 to, we have countries with, what is the lowest? Like Burundi, $732, Congo, 767. So those are countries with very low GDP per capita. And of course, poverty is prevalent here. So I gave you 3 different measures. Please keep them in mind. You might see them sometimes in some newspapers reporting GDP growth or GDP per capita. You might have the idea how useful they are. So the last slide is GDP a measure of what really happens in the economy? Does it really measure the well-being of society? Well, in some cases, yes. I think the absence of some other metrics make the GDP a good idea, a good reference for production. So, so GDP captures all these issues, but so at some point there are many issues that are not captured by GDP. For example, leisure time. So that is very hard to measure. How people choose between working harder and not working too hard. So, for example, in societies like the American society, people work smarter, I would say. So, and they have very conscious about leisure. So also GDP, even though it's a good metric, doesn't capture environmental issues. For example, China, in the past years, pollution has been very hard in China. So we see the Chinese GDP growing very fast, but that doesn't account for the environmental damage. So also some production that is not exchanged in the market. For example, some countries relied on black markets. So for example, in Mexico, I would say that, for example, drug production, like people selling illegal drugs. So that production is not captured by the GDP. Why? Because it's not exchanged in the proper market. So also GDP, for instance, tells you how big the economy is, how strong the economy is, how fast it grows, but doesn't account for inequality. For example, GDP in America, $62,000 is very high. But if you look at income inequality in the American society, so you can see that that is not reflected in the value of GDP. So I guess that's basically what I want to say today. So does anybody have a question?
Yeah,
Hello?
are you currently working or no?
Hello?
I'm not working.
No questions? Questions? Well,
No questions.
Yeah.
okay. So if anybody has a question, feel free to use the chat room. So remember, the chat room is here. If you have any other question, please send me an email and I will be responding as fast as I can. So probably tomorrow I will schedule, no, probably not. I will let you know when the next class is gonna be. So I think I will see you soon. Okay. One question over here. Okay, no questions. Okay, guys, see you next time, probably in 2 days. Okay. So
Have a good day.
Okay, Professor.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice day.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
Professor.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.